All right, it looks like we are now live for the next AMA. That is Ask Me Anything session. I've already got a lot of questions lined up, so I'm just going to jump into them right away. I'll mention I'm a little bit more dressy today than usual, in part because I've just finished shooting a sequence of videos for my upcoming existentialism class at Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design on Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So let me actually start a little bit out of order with one of my favorite YouTubers, Math Wolfu. Who is my favorite philosopher to study? That is a very difficult one. It's not asking me, as so many people always do, who is your favorite philosopher, which is an even harder one. Who is your favorite philosopher to study? It's a little bit more specific. I think that's changed a lot over time. I would say, I can give you like maybe a top 5 or so. Aristotle is definitely in there. I love digging through his works because there's so many interesting things that I uncover. Epictetus is another one, the great Stoic philosopher. Cicero as well. But I really do enjoy, even though I disagree with him on so many things, Friedrich Nietzsche. I think he's really an important person to study. And who else do I find genuine enjoyment in as well? I would actually say St. Anselm of Canterbury, who I've done a lot of work on over the years, and who I've just got a new piece coming out fairly soon in the St. Anselm Journal about St. Anselm and virtue ethics. So that's a good segue into Shaf Ali Khan's question, what is virtue? There is no agreed upon answer for that, although some people may try to sell you one. There's a whole bunch of different traditions of virtue ethics, very substantive traditions, the Platonist one, which includes people like Plutarch, and then I would say goes into Neoplatonists. The Aristotelian tradition, of course, the Stoic tradition. I mean, the Epicureans even have their own kind of thing going on, although we don't, unfortunately, have too many texts from them. And then we get into, Christian virtue ethics, and it goes on down to the present. But the one thing I think you can say that they all do have in common is viewing virtues as states of character that are developed through acting and sort of some sort of training or disciplining process. Now, what exactly are the virtues? Well, that kind of depends on who we're looking at, right? Per obización. I should someday learn how to pronounce that correctly, since I get questions from that person quite a bit. Thoughts on the ethics of torture? Is the ticking time bomb scenario useful? I mean, things like that do come up from time to time, don't they? So it is good to talk about those, say in an intro or an ethics class. Much of the time, the ethical decisions that we have to make are not in quite such a clear format, especially when it comes to questions of torture. It's rarely that we're considering, well, there's a bomb about to go off, and only if we torture this person will we possibly get the information that we need. What we do know is that in many, and they knew this in ancient times, by the way, torture is not a particularly effective way of getting information. Let me rephrase. It's not a particularly good way of getting true information. It's a great way of getting somebody to say what it is that you want them to say, or what they think you want them to say. So it's not a particularly effective means. And then, we could also talk about all sorts of gradations. Is sleep deprivation torture? It certainly can be intended to be that way. And there's, different things are going to hurt people in different ways. So that's a good question. AP, have you read Jean Baudrillard? Was he a nihilist? I don't see him particularly as a nihilist. I guess it depends on how you're understanding nihilism. I understand it as an embrace of nihilism as sort of the solution to the problem of nihilism. There's sort of like we're in a situation in which, as Nietzsche diagnosed, the highest values have devalued themselves, at least for many people. And so that's the nihilistic situation. And then there's like, well, let's embrace that. And that could take a number of different forms, like, just shit posting is a great example. If that's all you do, I think that's pretty nihilistic. Baudrillard is a, very prescient analyst of media and meaning, who was, well, I mean, then again, so was Kierkegaard with the present age, right? So it's not like he's got the market cornered on that, but he's definitely worth reading. Daniel asks, can I break down Blondel's idea that our understanding of action is fundamentally incomplete if one brackets out the supernatural? He wasn't so concerned about bracketing out the supernatural. As a matter of fact, that's what he does early in his work, right? He brackets it. He's in effect carrying out a phenomenological analysis in order to be able to bring people along who otherwise, in the milieu that he's writing in, the very enlightened, Third Republic, would say, "Oh, you're talking religion? That's irrationality." The what we called the rationalists back then, or what we now call the secularists of our time. He was dealing with people who were actively hostile to any notion that there could be any connection between religion and rationality. And I mean, his view, you see it discussed in the last section of Action, is that you're welcome to work out whatever sort of world view you want to and conception of the universe. But if you're analyzing human action, there's so many sort of places where what we're calling here the supernatural, something that would go beyond the merely natural, intervenes within it, so that you would need some sort of, at least you have to take account of the fact that people can reject that, right? And that's, I mean, Blondel is a very difficult thinker. It was one reason I haven't done that much writing on him, to adequately convey his ideas, because he's sort of like he's called the French or Catholic Hegel, because everything's connected to everything else. So that's as much as I'm going to do with that for today. But maybe down the line I'll return to Blondel. I read him, but I don't write on him or present on him too much. Jack, why isn't Shestov, that's Lev Shestov, the great Russian Jewish thinker who emigrated to Paris after the revolution, and who, as he's pointing out, isn't particularly well known. Why isn't he well known? My channel seems to be the only thing on YouTube I can find addressing his stuff. I don't know if there are any other things on YouTube. I will say this: there is at least one contemporary scholar of some significance who does have a book chapter on Shestov, and that's Boris Groys in his book on anti-philosophy. I think Shestov isn't particularly well known for several reasons. One is that, there's this tendency on the part of those who are engaging in philosophical study, particularly those who are doing academic work, to take the verdict of the past as determinative. And by the verdict of the past, I don't mean like they actually research Shestov. I mean they look around and they see that not a lot of people are working on him, and there's not a lot of discussion on him, so he must not be important, right? And it's a kind of intellectual laziness, I would say, that's rife throughout the academy, but also rife throughout public philosophy as well. So it's not like we're going to, hold the academicians to a higher standard that way. And this happens a lot with like translation stuff. Going back to Blondel, Blondel was an incredibly important 20th century philosopher. A lot of people don't know him because the only book that got translated, other than some of his early works by Fiacre Long, was the two translations of L'Action, first by James Somerville and then by Oliver Blanchette. Oliver Blanchette, by the way, translating the work again, because he said the Somerville translation was so bad, and he was teaching it at Boston College. And a lot of people will assume, well, if it's not translated, then it must not be considered important enough for me to take a look at, so I'm not going to look at it. And then, of course, nobody translates any more stuff. That's a cycle I tried to break unsuccessfully with translating 4 pieces by Blondel in my book about the 1930s Christian philosophy debates. But unfortunately, Catholic University Press priced that out of most people's price range and did not accomplish its purpose. So Shestov suffers from a similar sort of thing. The only reference I think that most people encounter to Shestov is in Camus' Metaphysics, where he basically writes him off as one of those crazy existentialists, and they don't go into looking, well, why was Camus referencing him, and what's there. The other thing is, Shestov's works are very anti-systematic, and they're in some respects more like further along the leap of faith stuff than Kierkegaard is, more, corrosive cultural critique than Dostoevsky or Nietzsche, both of whom he wrote on. So it's challenging work, and it's not easy to present on. I had a hard time doing the videos that I did. So let's move on. Chip, to what extent have the editions of Nietzsche's writings available in English been compromised by Elizabeth, that's his sister, tampering? Should certain editions be avoided because of this issue? You think she tampered a lot with Thus Spoke Zarathustra? I don't know about that. I think the biggest thing is not beyond good and evil, the will to power, right? That was mostly notes, and then she kind of cobbled it together into a work. She also, took out apparently some of Nietzsche's references to anti-Semitism, where he said anti-Semites are basically idiots, and also some of the criticism of German nation stuff. But there's enough stuff in Nietzsche that made it through her censorship in the early on stuff. I don't think any of the more recent editions that's going to be a problem with. But you got the will to power wasn't really a finished work. She tried to turn it into something that it wasn't. So, but I don't think you really have to worry too much about that these days. Bruno Dalmolin asks, is there a purpose to art? And that is a question that I was bringing up with my class at Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design this semester, sort of seeing what the art and design students had to say about that, the ethics class that I taught there. Would it be similar to that of philosophy or religion in expressing the absolute as Hegel thought was the case until his time? I can tell you that it's definitely not the case like that for most artists today. Quite frankly, a lot of artists are trying to, make a buck or make a reputation or, express something that they're interested in, or they see something over here and they want to replicate it in some way, or they're playing with ideas. Now, he follows up, can it currently be anything we want like Danto thinks? Danto doesn't think it can be anything we want. Danto thinks that it's whatever the sort of community of people that comprise the art world are willing to call art, right? So not everything can be passed off necessarily as art. The question is whether you can get somebody else to accept it as art or not. One of the cool things I will say about teaching a class on that sort of thing is that it introduces the students to the idea that maybe art is located within a larger set of purposes or values, and that's not something I think that they're getting too much, except for art should serve politics or morality, not like conservative morality, but some other kind of morality, like criticism of capitalism or pushing the envelope on liberatory movements. But I had them read, for example, Tolstoy, his work on the purposes of art, and we discussed it in class. And we read some Kant. We didn't read any Hegel. Maybe next time around I'll work that in. So, all right. Daniel asks, did you ever have an atheist phase? If so, what was it like, and what eventually changed your mind? I not only had a phase, I had a decade. I left the Catholic Church by the time that I was about 16, while I was still going to Catholic school. And a lot of it had to do with terrible catechesis, The people who were teaching us about religion here in the Midwest in the 1970s and 80s, most of them didn't know anything. It was all just kind of like, well, God is love. Let's be nice to each other, and for a kid growing up in this area, struggling with a lot of difficulties, hearing that sort of pablum did not do anything for me. And then, of course, my dad died when I was 11, and I had the local, Catholics and evangelicals sort of walking me through how not to be angry at God, and there's a big purpose to it. And I was like, this is all kind of bullshit, And I saw, the hypocrisy and the, sort of subordination of genuine religious values to all sorts of other crazy aims, whether it was my friends going and getting themselves confirmed so they'd get presents, or their parents, contributing to a church that they didn't believe in, or all this sort of stuff. And so, that had an effect on me. And I was very interested in religions at the time, and I was, starting to read around, and I read my way through the whole Bible, even the most boring parts, and started learning about Hinduism and Buddhism and Confucianism, and about delving into these things. But I had the sort of viewpoint that religion, although it may on occasion produce something interesting or useful, I sort of kind of Hegelian in that way, right? Religion, that's what you leave behind, and then you do philosophy, because religion is kind of picture thinking for lower level intellects. And what changed my mind was going to graduate school and having some important engagements and meetings with people who were genuinely religious and who were genuinely intellectual, and where the two of those things were not like in separate compartments, but where they informed each other. Meeting Sister Anne Estelle, great Chaucer scholar at Purdue, on a bus trip, and talking with her, and that was an interesting, eye-opening experience for me, seeing this kind of like, lady who was asking me questions about the Marion book that I was reading, and then started we started talking about stuff, and it became clear that she really had learned a lot, not in spite of being religious, but precisely because of being religious. And then studying people like Thomas Aquinas, and even more so St. Anselm of Canterbury, basically to work on my Latin. But then it kind of stuck with me. And then reading people like Gabriel Marcel and Maurice Blondel. I've always been interested in the people for whom religion didn't solve, becoming religious or taking on religion did not solve their problems, but it actually made the world richer and more complicated, and drew something out of them. And so that, the atheist, phase, I guess you could call it, basically went on for about a decade for me. So, all right, Anonymous, would I be willing to do a 24-hour live stream? That's a huge commitment. That would mean, like, I suppose, there'd be like bathroom breaks or something like that, but I'm not used to like staying awake for 24 hours at a time either. And I don't know, that would really wear on me. How much money would you need to get to do that? Could that be a Patreon goal? It could just be a long stream, would be epic. I don't know. Eventually I think my voice would get worn out. When I used to teach at Indiana State Prison, I would sometimes have 3 3-hour classes, and I'd be shouting over fans and air conditioning units, and I would have to like drink tea and have Ricola drops. And I would get home, and my vocal cords would just be like, their muscles, in effect, they would just be like, worn out, to where I could barely speak. I don't know if I could do that for that long today. But yeah, it would be kind of interesting. I don't know what's the attraction for people to have somebody on and just going on and on and on like that. I don't quite understand it myself. All right, Luca, what are some of the best arguments for the existence of God? I don't know. It depends on what your starting points are and what you're willing to accept. I don't think that there are, objectively best arguments. There are some arguments that are, pretty clearly weak, and they recognized as weak even in ancient times, like the argument for miracles, or the argument from common assent. Cicero goes after those on the nature of the gods. But, some of the more, I guess, reputable ones, the ontological argument, not like Descartes or like the 20th century, maximally perfect being nonsense that people put out there, but like Anselm's actual argument, I think is pretty good. But his argument is just, the ontological argument, which he never called such, is just a portion of a much larger unum argumentum. So, I mean, there's that. I kind of like Pascal's wager, but I like Pascal's actual wager, not the textbook caricature that people make of it, which means that you got to read Pascal, right? So that's good stuff. But different arguments are going to appeal to different kinds of people. So I know a lot of apologists who like really, really love Thomas Aquinas's 5 ways. I read them and I'm like, oh man, and that's what we call God. Okay, I guess we go on with that then. All right, Negro Cornelio, why do you think Albert Camus is an existentialist? Because he said he's not. I've already answered this so many times, but I'll do it again. What would be the arguments? It is this confusion that he said he is not. There's existentialist in the broad sense. There's existentialist in the narrow sense that Camus meant, right? If you want to know who he means by existentialist, you need to look at Metaphysics, look at what he characterizes as existentialism, and then you'll see that he's distinguishing himself from that. And then you look at the broad definition of existentialism, and he fits into it. I mean, it's that simple. I keep on having to answer this same question over and over again about that. The fact that he said he's not an existentialist in the narrow sense doesn't mean he's not an existentialist in the broader historical sense, any more than Gabriel Marcel saying he's no longer an existentialist, but a Christian Socratic because Sartre defined existentialism the way that he wanted to, or Heidegger saying that he's not an existentialist if existentialism means what Sartre means. We when we're doing like good history of philosophy, we look at the broad movement, and Camus clearly fits into that. Why take somebody's word that they're not part of a movement? Philosophers lie about that sort of stuff all the time. So, all right. Leithian or Leithlan, what are some good sources on nominalism? I don't know. Maybe Duns, William of Ockham. He's sort of like one of the people credited with it. Nominalism comes up in the discussions in the earlier scholastic period with this guy Roscelin. Check him out. I don't know. You probably, this is not something that I particularly work in. There's all sorts of nominalist philosophers, like Hobbes is kind of a nominalist. I suppose you could read him. But if you want something that's like treating nominalism as a subject, you probably have to Google, some sort of history of nominalism. That would be the way to go. Adam, what is the difference between thinking and reason for Heidegger? Well, thinking is broader and deeper, and reason would be, sort of much more structured kind of thing. It's similar to the distinction that gets made between, although Heidegger wouldn't like me saying this, but it's similar to the distinction that gets made in the Middle Ages between intellectus, and ratio, the intellect and reason, or that the German idealists reverse, where understanding or intellect is lower and reason, Vernunft, is above it. A lot of people have this kind of two-scheme thing where, different kinds of thought. Reason is a much more structured, articulate thought that isn't able to be is self-referential. So, Ika Ritola, what philosophical works would you recommend for business school students? As much as you can read, the people who are actually going to go somewhere in business and are going to survive in the long term are usually pretty big readers. And I don't think that you need to necessarily restrict yourself in that way. Reading Platonic dialogues would be great work for you. It's going to exercise your mind. Reading Aristotle, I think Aristotle actually has a lot to say to business people, but not directly. You have to do some of the work to kind of figure out how to apply his ideas about, organizations and leadership and all of that. You might take a look at people who other business people talk about but never actually read, like Adam Smith. I think that could be smart, right? See what Adam Smith actually did have to say on The Wealth of Nations, rather than just accepting the invisible hand of the marketplace takes care of everything. That would be good. Also critics of sort of the capitalism and the success-driven mentality, which would include, Thoreau or William James, who called success that bitch goddess, Marx, of course, I'm not saying you should read a lot of Marx necessarily, because that's a pretty big investment of time, but he's, worth understanding. I think a lot of it would, it would depend on what it is that you want to do. Reading Cicero would be pretty good for you to do. You get a good background in ancient philosophy that way. All right. AP, was Whitehead a mystic? I wouldn't say he was a mystic. I would say he was pretty devoted to articulating things, and mystics are usually saying not too much that's important can actually be articulated, but maybe you mean mystic in a different way. I knew somebody was going to ask about this. 55327. Did I see the Zizek-Peterson debate from yesterday? I did not. I've read a few summaries of it and takes on it, but I didn't have any interest in watching the two of them debate. I think debates are largely PR stunts and kind of a waste of time. I don't generally do them myself. In part because they don't actually usually convince anybody, and they're so stilted, and kind of a strange format. But I wasn't particularly interested in seeing the two of them debate. I've read Zizek's stuff in the past. He's been around for a very long time. We were reading him back in graduate school. And, I occasionally read his op-ed pieces. I don't watch his talks on videos or anything, because I'd much rather just read what he has to say rather than try to listen to him. I don't find Peterson profound at all. As a matter of fact, people ask me about him all the time. I think that, either he's being obtuse or stupid or lazy or just opportunistic in blurring together the categories that he does, like postmodernism and Marxism. I realize that he got that from Stephen Hicks's book, but he should know better than to trust something like that. I don't find, Zizek is kind of all over the map. He's an interesting guy. Peterson, I don't find really interesting at all, except as a phenomenon. So I wasn't really that interested in seeing what the great debate of the century was going to be. As it turns out, the analyses that I've seen, there's basically the Peterson supporters who are like, "Oh my God, he did so great," and you're like, "Come on," Now you're really straining credulity. And then there's the people who are like, "Well, Zizek didn't address some of his points, but clearly he was operating at a much higher level than Peterson was, who didn't seem particularly prepared." There's Zizek should have talked about this, or he shouldn't have talked about this. There's people who are kind of quibbling back and forth, but it seems kind of like the event that didn't meet the hype that was generated about it. So I'm sure I'll see another question about that down below. All right, the Hebrew love and support from Israel. Well, thanks. Letromir, Stoic philosophy is, in my understanding, a way to remove fears by the faculty of reason. Did they have any advice against the fear of going mad, or let's say having Alzheimer's? Yeah, I mean, they talked about fear of decline. I mean, Seneca actually mentions that in his letters. Unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, for him, Nero decided that issue for him by commanding him to commit suicide. If he hadn't committed suicide, of course, that would have been it for his entire family. Stoic philosophy is far more than just a way to remove fears by employing the faculty of reason. But what you want to do is you want to look at what's the nature of fear itself, and then you need to think about the objects of fear and why you fear them, and is it reasonable for you to fear them? And there's sort of a standard way of approaching that emotion as well as other emotions in Stoicism. But yeah, I mean, the decline involved in Alzheimer's, that's something that I've seen like in my own family. One of the particularly bad parts of it is when the person realizes they're in decline and they're like, damn it, this is just going to get worse and worse and worse. And some of them get very angry, like that was the case with my grandfather, because, they feel like people might be making fun of them, or, they're unhappy with themselves. That's maybe something I have to face down the line myself. Who knows? But Stoic philosophy can help with that. I think so can Aristotelian philosophy. So can existentialism. We're not necessarily confined to just one approach. Bruno Dalmolin must read philosophers who wrote in English. Oh, okay. It's a question. Do we have to read philosophers who wrote in English? Yeah, I mean, depends on why you want to do philosophy. I mean, if you want to understand Hume, I guess you could read him in translation if he's been translated into something else, but why not read him in the original if you can? Just like if you want to read Nietzsche, it's cool if you can read him in translation. It's cooler yet if you can read his German. And, I'm not saying you need to read everybody who wrote in English. Obviously, people are just churning out tons and tons and tons of new stuff, a lot of which is not worth reading. But I think if you're going to read philosophy, there's some English philosophers that you really do want to read, like Hobbes and Locke and Mary Wollstonecraft and Hume, Berkeley. I'd say you should probably read Adam Smith. He's worth reading, and then we can go on into further centuries. Andrew Hooper, what do you think is the strongest argument against the Stoic worldview? Also, could you explain how Stoics could believe our desires are under our control? I don't think there is a strong argument against the Stoic worldview. First, you have to define what you think that it is, and then it probably should bear some relation with what the Stoics actually said. If there's anything, it's probably a little bit too much optimism about how similar human nature is, how rational we can be, and how much can be accomplished. But you can find that in Pascal, right? He criticizes the Stoics for that. How could Stoics believe our desires are under our control? I don't know. I guess the same way that Aristotelians do, and the same way Platonists do. And this is a commonplace of ancient and medieval, and even a lot of early modern moral theory. Some of our desires we can actually influence by thinking about things different ways. It's not saying that like you can snap your fingers and say, I'm no longer going to desire this, but hell, if you can't change any of your desires, what prospects do you possibly have, right? I mean, this is not something radically unique to the Stoics. Desires and aversions, you practice, you engage in habit formation, you engage in analysis, you see what other people are doing. I think that even David Hume, with his famous, he loved taglines, reason can only be the slave of the passions, right? Well, read the rest of the treatise and see whether he really thinks that or not. He doesn't. We can change ourselves in some degree. So, James O'Corn, what do I think of Richard Rorty? He was a big thing back when I was in graduate school. I read some of his stuff. I was never particularly impressed. The idea that Wittgenstein and Dewey and Heidegger were all like anti-foundationalists. I mean, did we need Rorty to tell us that? That really didn't seem to be like super, news. That's the philosophy of the mirror of nature, right? By the way. His stuff about irony and solidarity, that's cool if you're like you're a liberal intellectual living in New England, I guess. I don't know how useful it is for the rest of us living in the rest of the world, and it does tend to represent Rorty's own views. I think 100 years from now he's going to be as unknown as Herbert Spencer is to most people in the present. But I think so will a lot of other people. Shaf Ali Khan, which is more important in life, meaning or happiness? Why assume that they're fundamentally different or opposed to each other? I don't know that a life that's happy doesn't include meaning. I think that meaning is pretty central to actually enjoying happiness. But I don't know how you differentiate the two. I mean, first you'd have to actually like clearly define what you mean by happiness, and it's not as if philosophers are in total agreement about that. Silver Shadow X. Any tips for a scholarship interview? Is wearing a tie overdressed nowadays? No. I mean, if you get some person who's kind of a jerk and likes to dress down, which how can you predict that? Maybe they'll hold wearing a tie against you, but I think it's kind of expected if you're a guy to wear a tie. It's sort of a sign that you're taking the thing seriously. And I wear ties quite a bit of the time, and I also don't wear ties quite a bit of the time. Sometimes I do it to convey that what we're doing is in a certain, framework, right? There's a ceremonial aspect to the tie. I think there was somebody, and I don't remember who it was, who called it like, an important part of the bourgeois uniform. Yeah, we wear uniforms, when you're going to go play sports. When I'm going to the gym, I don't wear my tie. I wear my shirt and my shorts and my gym shoes, and that's what I do there. And when I'm going to other places, I wear my nice cozy sweater and maybe a button-down shirt or just a t-shirt, or it's fine to wear a tie. Just make sure if you do get a tie, don't get like some goofy thing like a fish tie or something with all sorts of like crazy stuff on it. Just wear something like this, nice and simple, and you can get yourself into the habit of it. And don't worry, here I'll tell you this too. So don't worry too much about the knots, right? So I tie this. I'm not even sure what the name of it is, but it's the knot that I typically use because I'm a bit taller, so I have to wear long ties in order to make it work. And it's really quite simple and straightforward. You want to get into the habit of being able to tie a tie when you need to, right? So you go around once like this, and then you pull it back through here, and you shove it through, and you tighten it up, and there you go. There's a nice knot, and no real distraction thing. You can pull it down a little bit if you want to. People get into all sorts of crazy fancy knots. I think those are the same people who like to get really into whatever skincare they're putting on, or they get very obsessed about these little details. That, by the way, is what in the 1950s and 60s marketing people called marginal differentiation. I think they took that from the sociologists. You'll find that discussed in the David Riemann works like The Lonely Crowd, right? It's all these ways that people who don't have a way of differentiate themselves from others. Be pragmatic about ties, right? Good enough. Nobody's really good. If anybody's going to judge you about your tie, they're probably an idiot anyway. So, all right. Zama Zingo, Martin Heidegger on death, please. Could you advise me books about it? I don't speak or understand German, so how can I understand philosophy on his terms? You understand English, right? Read them in translation. Martin Heidegger talks about being towards death in Being in Time. So, you'll find it discussed in there. And there's plenty of stuff you can read specifically just on it if you're having trouble understanding Heidegger. There's secondary literature out there. I don't see how that's a big problem. Heidegger, thinks he talks about this in the first part of Being in Time section, that we have this whether we realize it or not, we have this being towards death. We can't actually understand our own death. but it's inevitable for us. So it sets a finitude for us, and we grasp this in part, although we grasp other things as well through anxiety or angst, this revelatory mood or Bestimmung that he talks about. I mean, you could also check out what is metaphysics if you want to. I have videos on that. As you probably know, I've got a whole sequence of core concept videos on that short work that encompasses many of Heidegger's great ideas. But you don't have to read everything in its original language. It's just nice if you can, but read it in translation. Don't be a purist. Just go at it. And remember too that when you first read Heidegger, you're not going to understand 3/4 of what you're reading. You just go at it again and again and again until you do. Same thing with like reading Aristotle. When I first read Aristotle, I was like, "What the hell is this crap?" Because we read the categories, and I'm like, in a subject versus about a subject, what is this? And over time you figure it out. Philosophy is not something that you grasp immediately the first time reading it through. It's a cumulative and sort of spiral process. You zero in on things. The Hebrew, did I study Maimonides? Yep, back in grad school, one of the people on our reading lists. Didn't really get into him much. A lot of people are into Maimonides. I'm not. I prefer to spend my time on other things. Although I'll probably be, I'm doing a paper this summer on thumos in the Platonic and Aristotelian traditions. So I'll have to probably dig into Maimonides to see if he has interesting discussions about that or not. La Hyra George, what are the main things one should remember about David Hume's philosophies? Well, here's the number one thing. The thumbnail sketches that people make about him are usually wrong. So like the is-ought distinction, you can't get an is from an ought. Bullshit. Sure you can. You just happen to have oughts already in the background. That's what Hume was actually saying. So you want to actually read what Hume said without automatically assuming that the very reductionist interpretations of Hume are in fact right. Or like the reason and passion thing. Yeah, he says that, but then read his works and you'll see that sometimes reason isn't just the slave of the passions, right? So I think that's probably the most important thing to remember about David Hume's philosophy. And it is a system. That's the other thing to remember. You got to read the whole thing. So I would start with the Treatise on Human Nature and go through that, and then then go to the two inquiries, and then all those other essays and stuff. It'll make a lot more sense for you. Robinson von Brum, what are your thoughts on Alexander Kochava? Kochava is sort of like Deleuze. He's an interesting reader of other people, but whenever he reads them, you always get more Kochava than you get the other person. So the introduction to the reading of Hegel, yeah, it's pretty, it's connected to Hegel, but it's not straight Hegel. It's Kochava's Hegel, right? And the things that he was really interested in. If you want a more close to the text reader of that time, you want his contemporary Hippolyte, right? Who translated the phenomenology into French and who's got his genesis and structure of Hegel's phenomenology. Kochava is a kind of an interesting guy also for what he got into. I mean, he was one of the people who really bought into the EU, the European Union vision, and was trying to, he played a role as a functionary within its organization. He wanted to see, a Europe coming together. And then the question is, well, how does that happen? So Kochava, interesting guy. Don't always believe everything he has to say, any more than you would with like Deleuze's Spinoza or Hegel or Bergson books or Nietzsche books, right? There's some interesting insights there, but you're getting more of their shtick than you are, the straight stuff. So, Mani Dolmanse, what do you think about translation and ideology and how one affects one another? Well, those are two really, really broad things. Ideology can mean a lot of different things. are you asking like, is it possible to ever have a translation that's not in some way conditioned by one's ideology? Probably not. But it's impossible to have a really great translation in most cases anyway. Even putting ideology aside, just dealing with going from one language to another, it's often quite tough. You can try to be conscious of ideological biases you might have, and you can try to make your translation relatively free of those. But it's pretty common for them to interpenetrate each other. I would say translation is a great way to learn about yourself and your capacities to communicate something in another language. That's kind of an interesting idea. So yeah, let's see. Byrigan13, what do you think of the theology of Pelagius? He was seriously overshadowed by Augustine. I don't know. I've never read like Pelagius straight. I don't know if we even have him straight, but so I can't say that much about it. He wasn't just overshadowed by Augustine. There were a lot of people who rejected Pelagianism. Here in the West, we tend to frame it just in terms of those two by themselves, but people were worried about his doctrines in other places. I will say that Pelagianism shows it represents kind of a recurring tendency. This notion that we can sort things out on our own. That it's a little bit perhaps over optimistic about our capacities, wouldn't you say? All right. Let's see, what else have we got here? Adam, am I familiar with Alexander Dugin and his fourth political theory? Nah, I haven't really read any Dugin. So I don't know what his fourth or second or third or first political theory is. Maybe someday if I have the time, I will, or somebody sends me a book, I'll check it out, but I don't have much time for that sort of thing. Robinson van Brum, what are your thoughts? Oh, we already did that. Kochava. Alan Moises Dalke, what's the best order to read Aristotle? There isn't one. You just start reading and keep going at it, and then going back and rereading. There is no easy formula. I'm actually going to talk. Of course, that I have started a new series of how to do self-directed study on different authors, and then I'm going to be doing one on Aristotle next month. So you can tune into that. I usually, I have my students reading stuff from the Nicomachean Ethics because I think that's the most accessible. A lot of people like to start students with throwing them into the categories. It's a great way to turn people off on Aristotle. But, if you're more into the logic stuff than the ethics stuff, why not do that? Or why not start with the rhetoric? Or why not start with the politics? Or if you want to get nice and confused, start with the metaphysics and the on the soul, right? There is no good way to get into Aristotle. There's no best, like, here, do this, and do this. Adam, how much mysticism is there in Hegel's philosophy? I'd say none. Again, mysticism depends on what you mean by it, right? If you mean like what Bertrand Russell or other analytics mean by it, then where things just aren't clear, and there's like some kind of fuzzy feeling about something, I suppose there's probably some mysticism there, but that's an abuse of the term that they got into. But actual genuine mysticism, a lot of people are like, well, what about Jakob Böhme and all that? There might be some inspiration for Hegel from that, but I wouldn't say that Hegel himself is actually in any real respect a mystic. He's sort of an anti-mystic. He doesn't want those kind of appeals to intuition and the what lies beyond thought. He wants to bring everything within thought and make it conceptual, begrifflich. So he's kind of the opposite of a mystic, which is part of what attracts me to him, because I don't like mystics. I'm not into people who are like, oh, you got it. Oh, you can see Sassy in the background prowling around. Our 16-year-old cat. I'm not into people who make appeals to like, oh, you've got to like, you got to deepen your understanding of this and open yourself up to the universe or any of that sort of nonsense. I want to know, what are you actually bringing to the table? If you want to tell me that there's some sort of process that I have to undergo before I'm going to understand, I'm cool with that, because that's part of virtue ethics. But I'd better find some understanding, and it better be something that can be articulated at the end of the process. All right, Memnock, what do you think about Ortega? That's Ortega y Gasset. Ratio vitalism. Maybe you could do a core concept video about it. Well, I probably wouldn't do a core concept video about Ortega if I ever do get around to shooting stuff. I'd have to do a series, right? Because what's the point in just doing one single video? Ortega y Gasset is somebody who I read a long time ago. Haven't read that much lately. The one Spanish author who I have been reading more frequently lately is Miguel de Unamuno. I'd wanted, when I was doing the existentialism series, which I may revive again someday, the longer 1-hour lecture videos, to do some work on Ortega y Gasset, but I never got around to it, and so we'll see what happens. I don't have enough to say about him. Robinson von Broom, the Hegelian argument, Stoicism is simply a form of slave morality. Nope, that's wrong. The Hegelian position on Stoicism is that it comes out of slave morality, but it's not a form of slave morality. It's something quite different. And that's why it's got its own section in Stoicism, skepticism, and the unhappy consciousness. So you're mixing it up with perhaps Nietzsche. But even Nietzsche doesn't think that it's just a form of slave morality. He thinks that it represents something that is productive but wrong. So you don't want to overgeneralize like that. Valentino Ralph John, what do you think about using philosophy as a mean or an aid in order to broaden one's scientific insightfulness? For example, if you're into languages and linguistics, you study Plato's Cratylus, etc. I guess it's fine for that. I mean, why wouldn't you, if you're into languages and linguistics, study everybody who's had something interesting to say about languages and linguistics, unless you're kind of like, many linguists kind of, they don't know about their own discipline and it's past. And similarly, sociologists who haven't read Marx or Weber or Durkheim or Auguste Comte, for that matter, or Herbert Spencer, don't really know that much about their discipline. So it's good for that, and it's good for, I guess, learning some more things. What they have to offer different theoretical disciplines probably varies considerably from discipline to discipline, though. I don't know that, for somebody who's doing chemistry, that reading ancient philosophy is going to, or modern philosophy even, is going to be that particularly helpful. But, for the social sciences, sure. Original Bon Jovi, do you consider Stoicism a form of deontology or virtue ethics? My own reading of Cicero, Seneca, and Epictetus tends towards virtue ethics, but my textbook labels it as a form of proto-Kantianism. Why do you have to choose between the two? Is a theory only deontology or virtue ethics? That's the sort of, schematic textbook approach that people take, but that's wrong. Real virtue ethics take into account, just read Alistair McIntyre, who is somebody, by the way, who sees Stoicism as proto-Kantianism, but he at least recognizes that virtue ethics has to engage with other traditions in order to strengthen itself. Stoicism has, virtue ethics. It is a virtue ethics, but it's also a virtue ethics with a lot of deontological elements to it, as is to some degree even Aristotle, right? Aristotle in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, lays down some deontological guidelines saying not everything has a mean, can't commit adultery to the right extent, that's always wrong. That's very deontological, right? Try to avoid reductive views, you're probably not going to get a great read on Stoicism from a textbook anyway. But you want to, reading Cicero, Seneca, and Epictetus tend towards virtue ethics. There's also a lot of deontological aspects to that, right? So what you can say is they're not hedonists. That's pretty clear. By the way, the paper that I mentioned earlier that's coming out on St. Anselm, who, by the way, has a lot in common with Stoics on this sort of thing, also construes Anselm as a virtue ethicist whose theory has a lot of deontological aspects to it. So that's kind of worth checking out. Diego Gerardo Tinko Arredondo, what is your take on abortion? I think abortion's a bad thing, and we should have much less of it if possible. I also, tend to think that most of the anti-abortion activists are people motivated more by fear and envy and hate than any sort of real care about the child. If you're going to insist that adoption, carrying the child to birth and adoption should be the alternative to abortion, then you better put your money where your mouth is and not just adopt children of your own, but work towards a world in which children who are in fact going to be adopted, or children who are going to be kept by low-income mothers who are going to have a hard time, are not going to be, having a very rough ride of it. So, I actually see both sides as like full of hypocrites and fools and people who claim to be of goodwill but actually aren't on the abortion issue. And that's been going on for quite a long time. Pretty much all of my life, I'd say. Gabriel Connor, as someone who enjoys St. Anselm and other Christian philosophers, how does one counter or dispute Kant's arguments concerning the inability to have knowledge of God? His arguments seem very strong. Well, they seem very strong from a Kantian perspective, don't they? You can say Kant's wrong about this sort of stuff. I mean, why assume that just because you're in the Kantian system and you've bought into his basic assumptions and terminology that he's actually got those things right? I mean, look at his successors, Hegel, right after him. Yep, ontological argument holds, and here's my own version of it, So, how do you counter or dispute Kant's arguments? You relativize them. They're great within Kant's own system. I don't know that they actually apply that well out of it unless you buy into that, Jonah Oliver, best book for a general overview of philosophy. No idea. I mean, it depends on what kind of reader you are. And I can tell you that when it comes to the history of philosophy, when I was, a student, we used Friedrich Cobblestone's History of Philosophy. I like it because Cobblestone is usually not wrong about stuff and gives you a nice, selection of passages, and he's pretty comprehensive. But, if you like more popular stuff, there's other ways to get into it as well. I don't think there is a best book, Eratosthenes, how do you get a religious person to understand the flaws of objective morality? I don't know. I mean, I don't know that many religious people who talk about objective morality. So I think we're moving in different circles. I don't know why we would not want to have objective morality. It sounds like a good thing to me. Is it that it doesn't take into account subjective motives or circumstances or things like that? I'm not sure why we want to reject it. Mr. Big Weak Knee, do you think Sartre misinterprets Heidegger like many suggest? If so, do you feel like it's to the detriment of Sartre's thought? Well, Heidegger certainly seemed to think Sartre was misinterpreting or selectively interpreting Heidegger's thought. He's definitely, got a different view on nothingness. He's much more Cartesian in his orientation than Heidegger is. I think Sartre is doing his own new thing, which is, so his reappropriation of Heidegger. I'm not going to say it's exactly like, say, Marx's appropriation of Hegel, but you're getting something very different as a result, right? And the question you have to ask is what Sartre doing, worth checking out and thinking the world through? And I think the answer is yes. I like Sartre quite a bit. I don't agree with him on quite a few things, but I also don't agree with Heidegger on quite a few things. And I think he's worth checking out as well. I guess, the question could be, when Sartre is reinterpreting Heidegger in ways that go against Heidegger, is he misinterpreting Heidegger in the sense that, like, he just doesn't understand Heidegger? Or does he know what he's doing and he's, steering it deliberately in that direction? I would say he's doing the latter. I would say also, like when he misrepresents Gabriel Marcel or Carl Jaspers, he's doing so deliberately too. I don't think that he's just not getting it. I think that he's choosing that stance because he wants to work out his own thing. And I'll mention too that when it comes to like ethics, Sartre never managed to produce a viable existentialist ethics. It fell to Simone de Beauvoir to do that in The Ethics of Ambiguity, which is, if you're going to read Sartre, you should read her too, I think. All right. 1, 2, 3, Leo, 1, 2, 3. What are my thoughts on veganism? I've got quite a few. I think that in general, it's good if we start moving away from a heavy meat and dairy dependent regime that's dependent upon factory farming, which is, really a horrible way of mistreating animals and creating misery and passing it on to, savings for the consumer. We've got ourselves caught within a food system that's quite horrific when you look into it. That said, I'm not a vegan and I'm not a vegetarian either. I'm an omnivore. And, in part that's because I'm sort of still thinking this stuff through and determining what I want to do. I have a lot of sympathy for low income people for whom we've created situations in which they're effectively priced out of ethical meat or dairy and have a rough time even acquiring, vegetables that aren't dependent on human misery in one way or another. And we have lots and lots of misinformation out there. I think that, vegans come in a couple different brands, right? There's the purists who are like, they're basically like a religious sect, and like many sects, excommunicate each other as heretics quite a lot. I don't fully understand what the well, I mean, we could delve into the impetus for that in all sorts of ways. I think it's kind of cool that things like the Beyond Meat burger is now going into fast food. Although I don't think fast food is necessarily the best thing, but it's there's a lot to be said there. I will say this: I think that it's very important not to be a super purist about this sort of stuff and be more like, listen, we can at least move in this direction, and that's not nothing. You get this idea from a lot of people, not just in terms of veganism, but any sort of intentional ethical living, that like if you're not doing everything you're doing is crap and nothing. And I think that's a bad way to go about looking at things. All right, here is a question from our Brain Hurts a Lot. Is there any philosophers that discuss the threats of climate change and how to look at this problem in a philosophical way? Yeah, there are. This is not like an area of my particular emphasis, but there's a lot of people working in environmental ethics who talk about this and who have been talking about it for years. I would say that, broadly the utilitarian tradition, so think about people like today, Peter Singer, think that it's important to address it, not just for its effects on us, but also the effects on animals who also suffer. I would say that, so here's the thing to say: you can take a lot of different philosophical traditions and adapt them to this question. I've been thinking about it in terms of like Stoicism and Aristotelianism and what these thinkers, who generally assume that we couldn't destroy the environment, what they would make of it if they realized just how big of an impact we human beings could have, and what sort of rethinkings would have to happen. So, for example, Stoics, they buy into the ancient notion of, man is the rational animal. We are sort of a fundamental leap in value above the other animals who are irrational, and the other animals and plant life and the world itself is here for us, for rational life, and not vice versa. I think that there are people out there, great example of somebody who's doing a lot of thinking about this today in the Stoic community is Kai Whiting. But I think Christopher Gill is also doing a good bit of thinking about this, and so are others. And there's people from a neo-Aristotelian perspective who are doing that. I think if you're looking at people coming at it more from a like a Rawlsian or development perspective. You can talk about the impact on the poor, especially. I mean, think about so things are in sort of flux for us here in the developed West. Take for example the state that I'm in. I'm waving in the background because Wisconsin is behind me and all around me. Things have changed radically here. The weather patterns are different. We don't get snow that sticks. Species are now invading that are replacing our native species. And you can say, well, that's always happening. Yeah, but I mean, the evidence is pretty clear that not only are the cyclical things going on, but also there's human generated climate change as well. And that could be good or could be bad. People are like, well, I don't have to shovel snow as much, but we're also getting other things happening as well. And if you think about where the majority of human beings live, those areas are going to be majorly impacted by climate change. And it's only a question now of what we do in response to it, how we plan for it, and whether we can curb the trend or whether we don't have the political will to push that through. You notice that here in America, we have one party that believes as a matter of dogma that there is no such thing as human produced climate change, the Republican Party, and we have a Democrat Party that, although they talk about a Green New Deal and stuff like that, really when push comes to shove, they don't do a hell of a lot to change things, right? Not enough to make a significant difference. Unfortunately, in other places where conservatives were a lot more rational about it, they're starting to buy the American conservative line and say that it doesn't exist either. So, we could approach this issue of climate change. I think there's people who are working directly on it, and I don't know that much about it. And then there's all sorts of ways that we can take the philosophies that we have out there and speak about it in meaningful ways. So, yeah. I'd look into like environmental ethics. Not an area of my particular concentration. All right, Whitebriar says Shestov is well known in post-Soviet Russia. I'll have to take your word for it because I don't know about it. Made of Clay, do I think philosophical phases ever end? As in, we never stop being into a philosopher, even if we say we're not. Well, because I had a Wittgensteinian phase doesn't mean I don't read and teach and talk about Wittgenstein, right? Or a Sartre phase. I just talked about Sartre earlier. But we do leave the phases sometimes behind. And some people stay in them their entire life. They become, Nietzschean and stay in Nietzsche forever. That's their thing. Oh, original Bon Jovi. How do you suggest dealing with professors, pragmatists in particular, who disparage the ancient and medieval thinkers as nothing more than historical curiosities? And this goes equally for analytic philosophers, most of whom know nothing about the past. And this also goes for many continental thinkers who are like, well, they're all conservatives, right? And maybe read some of them, but read them so that they can critique them. You're not going to make much headway with them. I ended up having to do my ancient and medieval philosophy when I was in graduate school, pretty much outside of the department with classics, English, and who else? Speech communication to a certain extent, studying Aristotle. You're probably not going to. I mean, here's how you deal with them: just like nod and then go on and do your work, and find yourself people and communities and organizations that actually do take medieval and ancient philosophy seriously, and support yourself with those. So we've got this whole modern Stoic movement. Granted, there's a lot of people in it who don't really know that much about Stoicism, but the people who are like the big heavy hitters, they sure do. Everybody on our modern Stoicism team are people that I'm proud to be working with, right? There's a great conference here in Wisconsin every year at Marquette University, just down the road, called the Aristotle and the Aristotelian Tradition Conference. Actually, it's back that way. Marquette's down the road that way. I'll be presenting there this year in June. So, you want to find these forums where there are people who really do take this stuff seriously. And that'll be your sort of lifeline when you're dealing with all the nonsense from the people who are dismissing ancient and medieval thinkers in your university. And the stuff that those people do have to contribute, the pragmatists, they're worth studying. Learn from them. It doesn't mean you have to be like, I'm only doing ancient and medieval, so I shouldn't study William James. William James is a lot of fun. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening in his work. I teach him pretty routinely in my classes. I'm not a pragmatist, but he's worth looking at. Same thing about Charles Peirce or Royce, or Dewey. I got kind of a bad taste for him because I was at SIU and it was like a Dewey fan club there. But there's even some stuff that's worth checking out in Dewey. All right. Valdemar. So when's that extensive video on the Neoplatonists coming out? Next year would be fine by me. I don't really do videos on movements, so I'm not sure where you got that idea from. Maybe down the line I will. But right now I'm doing a lot of core concept videos. I'm trying to get back into doing book review videos and other things like that. So, I'll work on some Neoplatonist figures, but I don't know the next time I'll get to them. I got all this existentialist stuff I got to shoot, and then I got to start thinking about what I need videos for in the fall as well. Tobias, does the training of the Guardians, I just lost his thing. Let me see here. There's a question about the Guardians. Boy, there's a lot of questions piling up here. Where is it? Does the training of the Guardians in Plato's Republic promote collectivism, or is it rather promoting education? Why not both? But it depends on what you mean by collectivism. Collectivism just for the sake of like whatever the society says is good? No, but it is promoting a kind of organic notion of society where the Guardians, excuse me, where the Guardians serve some determinate purposes and their lives are oriented around them. So that I think is quite important. Let me see here. Here's another question. Bob Johnson, how do I prepare myself for writing philosophy? I don't actually prepare myself because I've been doing it for so long that it's just something that I do. It's sort of like asking somebody who, sings all the time, what are the warm-up exercises that you do? Well, maybe I don't do any warm-up exercises anymore. Now, maybe other people would have good exercises for warm-up, but I don't know. Let's see here. Adam, I've read 60 pages of Athens and Jerusalem by Shestov. It's hardly as valuable as a couple paragraphs of phenomenology of spirit or being in time. I disagree. But, you get out of it what you get out of it, Negro, Cornelia, what do I think of Thomas Nagel's vision of the absurd? I haven't read Nagel for years, so I don't know. I'm sure Nagel had some interesting thoughts on it. Mubin Ahmed, what are my thoughts on perennial philosophy? If we're talking about like the Huxley kind of thing, I don't really buy into it. As a matter of fact, there's also a Catholic version where they talk about philosophy perennis. I never find that sort of framework very interesting. I'd actually rather just say there's a great diversity within the field of philosophy. Not everything fits into a nice, schema like that. Not everybody's doing the same thing. Ian, what is a good way to get into general philosophy for someone totally unfamiliar with it? I don't know what general philosophy is. I'm a thinker text person. I say start with primary texts and get into it, but that's my take. A lot of people don't do it that way. You could always buy yourself a textbook, and I encountered philosophy that way when I was younger. I'd buy a thing at a used bookstore and page my way through it, and then they'd have like their own version of how things are all set out. It's not going to kill you, but eventually you want to read some primary stuff. All right. Shaf Ali Khan, what did Goethe mean by the soul who sees beauty usually walks alone? Goethe, somebody I haven't read for a long time. I was kind of into him back in graduate school for a little while. I don't know, probably that when we're appreciating beauty, not everybody is in on the experience, and it's difficult to communicate it to others. Mani Del Monte, what do you think about the Oscar Wilde and art for art's sake? It's interesting that you don't see that formula in Wilde's works. It was kind of circulating around, and we associate it with Oscar Wilde. But as I was teaching this ethics for artists and designers and going through my texts and deciding what to give them, I had a hell of a time finding the formulations that are close to that in Oscar Wilde. And so I think that there's something to be said for it. Most of my students, interestingly, these artists and designers, I asked them, well, what do you think about this idea of art for art's sake? And they were like, I don't really buy it. Seems kind of self-indulgent, dissociated from everything else. They couldn't say, well, what else was art supposed to be for in any sort of consensus, but they were kind of uncomfortable with it. Let's see, Prohem. What are some common misunderstandings people make about Hegel? Well, there's lots of them. I guess the biggest one would be thinking that you can make sense of it with a quick read. Or, I'm getting people jumping in on my half-hour Hegel videos, and they're like, I don't understand what's going on here. And it's clear that they didn't begin at the beginning. You can't skip stuff in Hegel. Here's another one. The master-slave dialectic is not the main show in Hegel's thought. It's only just a tiny little sliver of what's going on. The thesis, antithesis, synthesis, schema, that's not actually Hegel. It's way more complicated than that. So I'd say those are some of the basic ones. Andrew, are the Penguin Classics the way to go for Seneca and Epictetus, or could you recommend other editions? I don't know. I mean, I read this stuff in multiple editions, and oftentimes in the original. So, there's for Seneca, there's a nice set that's come out recently with some pretty new translations, but I don't remember. They're sort of big, thick books. They might be from Cambridge or Oxford or somebody like that. Margaret Graver is one of the people who was involved in that. Let me see if I can actually find that. They were quite nice. Oh yeah, here we go. So the letters on ethics, Graver and Long translated them, and that is University of Chicago Press. Okay, so very cool. Those are pretty good. But I'm not a good person to ask, because I will jump from edition to edition to edition. When I'm doing my work on Epictetus, I've got my Loeb edition, which has the English and Greek on facing pages, and that's what I'm using. Made of Clay, would I ever try Twitch streaming? I don't know. I don't know what Twitch streaming is, so it's hard to say whether I'd try it. Hamid Shariati, in what ways are the philosophies in Spinoza and Nietzsche comparable? Not much. I mean, Spinoza is a hardcore monist. Nietzsche is a pluralist of pluralists. I mean, there's very little in which they actually connect up with each other, I'd say. Tamikuz, what is the best source to study Stoic notions of personal identity? Does death play any important role on the Stoic account? Death kills you. I mean, just read the classic Stoic text. Read Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius. Epictetus says you are your proeresis. That's the core of who you are. But all three of them have some view on that. Adida Pond, can I please upload some videos on Eastern philosophy? I get asked this every time. I'm not an expert on Eastern philosophy. I don't read Pali or Sanskrit or Mandarin, let alone classic Chinese. I also have a lot of other things I have to do, so I'm probably not going to be producing anything on Eastern philosophy anytime soon. I mean, if somebody wants to commission me to do it, then I guess I could do it. Oh, here's an interesting one. Original Bon Jovi, what do I make of William James' reformulation of Pascal's wager? So that would be in The Will to Believe, which I will be teaching here in Milwaukee at my MATC Intro to Philosophy class. When? About 2 weeks from now. 2 weeks and 2 days. Next week we're doing existentialist thinkers, and then we're jumping into James. I think The Will to Believe is a great essay. And one of the problems with Pascal's wager is it's very centered on like the Christian way of looking at things. James kind of generalizes it. I think he's totally right that there are some things we have to commit ourselves to first, and then we get to figure out whether they're actually true or useful or generative or not. Janeth Jijo, is untruth the condition of life? How do I live with it? I guess if you think it is, then maybe you want to start with Nietzsche's On Truth and Lies in an Extra Moral Sense, which I have a whole sequence of core concept videos on. So you could check that out. Andrew, what did the Stoics mean by nature? Very complex thing. It includes the natural world. It includes our nature. There's a whole video that I did on what in accordance with nature means for the Stoics. So you might want to check that out. It's something I'm working on a book on still. It's not a simple thing. I've also got a few essays in Stoicism today about that. Mani Dalmas, what do I think about Russian formalism, especially Bakhtin? Well, I'm a fan of Bakhtin. I don't get to read him very much, but I really enjoy his Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics. And, I think that's a great approach to things. His book on Rabelais, I used to really like. Now, not quite so much. I've never made my way through Art and Answerability, but I'd like to down the line. So I enjoy him. Here's a very different kind of question. How do I find my passion in life? Now, if you're asking like in the generic, I'd say, well, you got to kind of like look around and open yourself up to things and see what you respond to, and also be ready to have it grow or change on you over time. For me, I didn't have to find it. Instead, it found me. I'm kind of fortunate in that respect when it comes to philosophy, right? So, I think we're in a very fortunate time in that we have access to the internet, and that opens us up to so much more than we had available to us in the past. We can save ourselves a lot of time, right? But then a lot of the internet is pretty shallow, although very wide. You got to figure out how do you get deep into things. All right, we have 7 minutes left. I'm going to scroll down and see what else is easy to take, and just answer things in rapid succession. Here's a quick one. Ever considered growing the full beard? This is from Jordan Duder. No, because it doesn't grow here. It's very straggly here. So that's why I have the beard that I do. According to you, the Socrates conviction was right or wrong? Manish Pardeshi, it was wrong, but it worked out right for history. Let's see what else we got here. Scrolling back up. What are my thoughts on Rene Guénon? I think, I've said this many times. There's traditionalists out there that you can read. He's not somebody that I've spent any real time with. I read the more, 19th century traditionalists. Seems to be doing more or less the same kind of thing, only he's mixing in perennial philosophy and stuff from other religions in with it. Wrath of the Lamb, are you considering doing a banjo video again? Would be nice if you showed us some of your best songs. I'd have to start practicing. So that means that if I do it, it'll be sometime in the summer. because I hardly ever have the time nowadays to practice. But I could do some. That would be kind of fun. I did a banjo video for my son who was asking for it for his class, and then I made it available for my Patreon supporters to check out. All right. Where do I stand on the realism, anti-realism debate from 2046? I don't, most of these sort of isms, I don't really worry too much about. Again, I'm a thinker and text person, right? So, yeah. Jaco Pasto, were you always smart, or did you work your way through philosophy through hard work and perseverance? So, I'm one of those people who's smart in some respects and dumb in other respects. I made a lot of dumb mistakes in my life, some of which stemmed from, just coming from a background where people didn't didn't have that much useful to provide me with. I was in effect first generation college, but some of it also stemmed from my own obstinacy and inability to see what was staring me in the face at the time. Philosophy has helped me with that. I don't usually think of myself in terms of being smart or not. I did a lot of very hard work when I was in graduate school, both with like my languages and with studying the history of philosophy. And I've been, relying on the fruits of that for quite some time, especially as I taught a lot of classes. And I learned a lot too by teaching classes and developing resources. Every time like I, shoot a video, I'm relearning something, although it's a constant process, as Plato points out in the Symposium. Where our minds, there's always bits going out and new bits coming in. They're not permanent possessions that we have. We have to keep up with it. So it's sort of like working out. But here's what I will say. Anybody who wants to study philosophy can study philosophy. And if you stick with it, you will make progress in studying it. So this is quite important. Have some confidence in the material, have some confidence in yourself, as I said in the Plato video that I released. Here's a funny question. Horizonberg. Dr. Sadler, who are you and why was this in my recommended feed? I don't have any clue why it was in your recommended feed. You can find out all about me, just Google, right? I'm a person who does philosophy in a public way, and I've been doing that for years. But it's easier just to use Google. Adam Sparrow, did you see the Zizek debate? No, I deliberately didn't want to see that because I thought it would be kind of a waste of my time, and I have so many other things I needed to do instead. Let's see here. Binary epidemic. What do I think of the rise in pagan sentiments in Europe? I think paganism, never went away. If you read stuff from the Middle Ages, it's not as if the church came in and then suddenly this vast agreement descended upon everybody. They were constantly having to struggle with not even just paganism, but just things falling apart. Anselm, the guy I do a lot of work on, he's got to write these letters saying, don't let this priest out into the town, because every time he does, he gets drunk and starts chasing women, and we gotta knock that stuff off, right? And so there's always been sort of a struggle. Europe was never fully Christianized. And then when the parts of it that were, they didn't do it right. That's like somebody like Kierkegaard points out. So I think it makes good sense. As religion in its traditional senses decline, people want to find alternatives to that. And one alternative is a return to what they think to be paganism, which is usually pretty far removed from any real historical paganism. But people like to do that sort of thing. Let's see. Let's see another one. Joanne Lafont, have I heard about Gene Wolfe's death? I certainly did. I'm sad to hear about it. He was one state south of here, and I was hoping, I did a talk on him in our series, and I was kind of hoping that maybe I would actually like find the time to write him a letter and see if I could meet him and chat, and that would be kind of cool. But he's gone. That means the loss of a great speculative fiction writer, person who wove a lot of philosophy into his work. So it's kind of sad, but he lived a long and productive life. Let's see. What else can I go out on? Let me see if there's a nice, easy one to take. Well, this is kind of a joking one. It's too good. It's way too good, says. This philosophy stuff is great and all, but you should just start selling out theaters and hosting WWE debate wrestling matches against conservatives instead. Well, I'm not in shape to do wrestling matches. Although I do make it to the gym every once in a while, I'm not remotely in the shape that I used to be back in my teens and 20s. And I do enjoy the philosophy stuff. I can't really picture myself deliberately shifting into a career that would mean not doing it anymore. So, maybe I could sideline as that, but I think I'd want to be the guy who's like the announcer instead, and now so-and-so has got him in a Sorites hold or something along those lines. All right, let's see if there's one other nice thing I can go out on, although that was quite a funny one. Here we go. Okay, so here's a good one to give kind of a pep talk on. So Jaco Pasto, I'm finding philosophy too difficult even after spending a decent amount of time with it. I love the subject, but I still don't understand most of it. And he follows up saying, I'm interested in Heidegger, Nietzsche, and Foucault. So you picked three very difficult thinkers. And, you still don't understand most of it. Well, that's going to be the case for a while, not least because each of the thinkers that you're picking not only writes in a difficult way, and each of them is a great stylist too, by the way, but they're also referencing all these other thinkers. I would say you probably would be better off backtracking a bit and starting with, ancient and then medieval philosophy and going into modern philosophy and setting yourself, a set of like goals, like maybe pick 20 people along the way to Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Foucault who you want to understand halfway decent. Plato would be one of them. Aristotle would be one of them. Pick Epictetus or Seneca for a Stoic, and Descartes would be one, and that will be quite helpful for you. The other thing to keep in mind is it's okay if you only understand a quarter of what you're reading when you're beginning. That's actually pretty good. So just keep at it, and more of it will slowly become clear over time. I still, I've been doing philosophy now. I first started academic philosophy in college in 1990, so almost 30 years of that. I'd studied a little bit before, but I still find things where I'm like, holy crap, I've been getting this wrong the entire time, or I didn't know about this, and I still read people who are new to me as well. So it's okay if you're not getting it all at once. And so I think that's a nice positive thing to go out on. Thanks to everybody for your questions and comments. Obviously I didn't get to all of them, but I'll do another one next month. I'll also be doing some philosophy pop-ups, one here on YouTube, one on Facebook Live, and I'll announce those in my Facebook and YouTube and to my Patreon supporters as well. So have a great rest of the day. I've got to get back to work. I've got a ton of work waiting for me for the rest of the day. And just, all of those of you who are studying philosophy, just keep plowing away at it. As they say these days, the slang is keep grinding, and it will be rewarding for you.